Here, okay. Hello, welcome everyone to this panel from the Rebecca Harding Davis Society. We're so excited you can join us. We are here today with 4 scholars on this panel called Possibility, Toxicity, and Metaphysics in Rebecca Harding Davis's Life in the Iron Mills. My name is Aaron Rovan. I am the chair of the panel. I'm a PhD candidate at West Virginia University. And we're joined by 4 other folks. And the way that we're going to do this, I am going to read everyone's introductions and biographies, and then we'll just kind of go right through. So I will only kind of jump in here and then again at the end for some discussion. So first is Kacie Fodness. She's from the University of South Dakota. Kacie is a PhD student there, and she specializes in 19th century American literature. Her primary interest is in the American Renaissance tradition, in particular the work of Herman Melville, Emily Dickinson, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Her dissertation considers the poetics of possibility, conclusion, and unfinished forms in the long 19th century. And she will be presenting Possibility and the Unfinished in Rebecca Harding Davis's Life in the Iron Mills. Second, we have Sean Kelly. Sean is Associate Professor of English Literature at Wilkes University, where he teaches courses in 19th century American literature, African American literature, literary theory, and composition. His recent publications include There is a Place Where Terror is Good, Aeschylus's Orestian Myth of Law and Lacan's Theory of the Four Discourses, which was published in 2018, and Staging Nothing, The Figure of Dosting in Poe's The Raven. And that was published in the Psychology in Poe collection in 2019. Sean will be presenting The Rhetoric of Secrecy and the Epistemological Problem of Rights in Rebecca Harding Davis's Life in the Iron Mills. Third, we have Lauren Peterson. Lauren is a PhD candidate in English at UC Davis, who studies 19th century transatlantic literature. Her dissertation focuses on mid-19th century literary depictions of haunted and interconnected locales of industry, and the project is currently titled Industrial Specters, Mills, Ports, and Mines of 19th Century Literature. Selections of Lauren's dissertation have been published in Literary Geographies in 2019 and Venti in 2021. And she will be presenting Toxic Ghosts in Davis's, and that is Jack's. I seem to have lost your title, Lauren, so I'm sorry. I'm just going to ask you to say it when we get to you can just kind of say your title then, okay? I'm so sorry, Lauren. And then finally, we have Jack Widener. Jack is, he is a recent graduate of St. Francis University. He got his bachelor's degree in English with a concentration in literature. And Jack will be presenting Davis and Melville, America's Original Realists. And Lauren, I found your title while I was kind of reading that. Lauren, I'm sorry, will be presenting Toxic Ghosts in Davis's and Melville's Industrial Fiction. So my apologies for that little mix up. So Kacie, if you're ready, you can start whenever you want.
You bet. Thank you, Aaron. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As Aaron mentioned, I'm going to present a portion of my dissertation, and this section I've entitled Possibility and the Unfinished in Rebecca Harding Davis's Life in the Iron Mills. In 1861, Rebecca Harding Davis published the short novella Life in the Iron Mills. The piece was largely met with praise for its formal and thematic originality. Davis's work chronicles the story of Hugh and Deborah Wolfe, the former defined by his sickly pallor and post at the local iron mill, and the latter portrayed as an equally wan caretaker and cousin. Despite being a, quote, furnace tender at Kirby and John's rolling mills, end quote, Hugh Wolfe is artistically inclined and, in his spare time, fashions grotesque and, quote, strangely beautiful, end quote, statues out of the remnants of processed metal from the mill. His art, however, is almost entirely ephemeral, the narrator relaying how the artist would, quote, hew and hack with his blunt knife, working at one figure for months, and when it was finished, breaking it into pieces, end quote. Although this artist's tendency is to destroy his own work when it is, quote, finished, at least one statue does survive and eventually operates as the central artifact around which Davis's story is shaped. Residing in the Wolf's former residence, the narrator of Iron Mills goes about telling their story in the shadow of Hugh's surviving statue. Quote, nothing remains to tell that the poor Welsh peddler once lived, but this figure of the mill woman cut into coral. I keep it hidden behind a curtain. Sometimes, tonight for instance, the curtain is accidentally drawn back and I see a bare arm stretched out imploringly in the darkness and an eager wolfish face watching mine. A face through which the spirit of the dead coral cutter looks out with its thwarted life, its mighty hunger, its unfinished work. Its lips seem to tremble with a terrible question. Is this the end? They ask. Nothing beyond, no more? End quote. For my purposes, it's important to note that during this literary moment, there are only a handful of times the word unfinished appears. Yet this image of a surviving artifact, often mystical, placed in a story to invite the question, quote, is this the end, is an established pattern in American literature. In short, the American unfinished is, for me, an active artistic choice to leave a text open and unresolved. Its purpose is to ready a text for a future reader, one that is yet unknown but still familiar. While my larger project traces this phenomenon throughout the long 19th century, this paper must necessarily follow a narrower set of examples that showcase the quality of unfinishedness and the accompanying resistance to fixity and conclusion it demands. In Iron Mills, Davis situates her reader in a faded milieu, her smoky town the stage for a grand drama of Providence. But she does not leave us there. The story of Hugh and Deborah may rightly be read as early American realism, a faithful representation of a budding industrial nation. However, in telling this story within the walls of the Wolf House and years after the fact, Davis unfinishes the narrative in any genre that might be said to contain it. As Dana Seitler and others have noted, Davis's text fails to conform to a single literary genre, though fails is a term we must use lightly and with every constructive edge it contains. Ultimately, my work extends what Seitler calls, quote, ungenre, or what Emily Dolan calls, quote, troubled conclusions, toward an intentional poetics of possibility that subverts the temporal limits of the 19th century narrative. This rhetorical phenomena of the unfinished presents in less tangible variations too. A word, or the omission of one, that shifts the readers away from a stable narrative universe towards something more dynamic, unresolved, and likely more uncomfortable. The American unfinished is, for me, a deliberate authorial practice that facilitates the experience of a text in the future. This same commitment to what is possible allows the 21st century scholar to offer new readings of Davis's work. This open text, even now and even today, presented to us, quote, to be tested, end quote. Davis's Iron Mills insists on possibility, even as its characters seem prisoner to fate, or put another way by Davis, quote, a little turn of the rudder, end quote. The lives of these characters would seem in direct contradiction with the openness required for the unfinished, which is perhaps why I look outside the story proper to find it, namely at the story's edges and as told by the narrator retrospectively. While I am most interested in a quality akin to openness, Davis's Iron Mills, and indeed her life, invites us to first consider the related notion of permanence. Her loudest commentary on agency and that which lasts is, of course, the surviving statue. Permanent and that which can last is a concept which not only defines the novella, but one that concerned her person as well. In her essay, Writing Behind a Curtain, Rebecca Harding Davis and Celebrity Reform, Ariel Zebrock reminds us that Davis's distaste for celebrity, here evidenced by her refusal to be photographed, was linked to her belief that art should be, or at the very least has the potential to be, immortal. Through the future-oriented position of the narrator, Davis shows us that her Hugh was not immortal. And based on the, quote, terrible question his status asks, we are to understand that neither will this narrator or reader be. And yet we are not to miss that the statue, or even simply the legend of the statue, will survive. It has already survived the typically immediate and destructive pattern of its sculptor, as well as new tenants in the place it's stored. to say nothing of the certain mystical qualities it seems to possess, becoming for a time animate and making certain its continued persistence. While I'm unable to fully unpack this element today, a longer version of my work takes up the ghost story as it relates to the American unfinished. Seabrook argues that, for Davis, images or photographs of the author were linked to, quote, an embodied existence that promoted, quote, fixed boundaries on the interpretation of text, end quote. These boundaries were, of course, to be avoided. More than a narratological element, Seabrook notes how throughout Davis's life and career, she would identify herself not by her name, or at least not primarily by her name, but as the, quote, author of the text she had written. Donning the moniker of author of life in the Iron Mills, it seems, got Davis closer to something enduring than did the name she was born with or even the pen she wrote with. And importantly, it helped her defy those same, quote, fixed boundaries that were placed on the text itself. Another way that Davis and several others ensure their work remains outside of those fixed boundaries is the way they conclude their texts. Unsurprisingly, I've found no better sight of the unfinished than the endings of these 19th century works. Dolan, in her recent essay, Rebecca Harding Davis and the Troubled Conclusion, reminds us that, quote, conclusion and closure are not necessarily synonymous terms. One can reach the last page of a text without actually finishing the narrative, as ending a narrative sequence and bringing closure to the narrative story are two separate and not necessarily related tasks. In its simplest form, the text ending wraps up the narrative threads. The text has closure, end quote. Similarly, I argue that if Davis has little interest in conclusions, she has even less in closure. This is why the extradiegetic narrator becomes so important a feature. By its very nature and position in the text, the narrator perspective resists closure and tells of another story that exists in another spatio-temporal plane entirely. Though Davis has been criticized for her traditional, even sentimental endings that are inconsistent and perhaps incompatible with the text as a whole, she preserves the integrity of the story proper with what Dolan calls a, quote, troubled conclusion. This sentiment of the last line of Iron Mills, this alleged, quote, promise of dawn, end quote, is quite literally overshadowed by the presence of the statue in the darkness, to say nothing of the new art she introduces here of a, quote, half-molded child's head, end quote. We know not if it is broken or unfinished. At the start, Davis invites us into an overly determined space, a world offering no escape, save for the fact a God who may or may not, quote, take care of his own, for those sentenced to the mill each day as if to prison. This place becomes a space in which these characters can potentially, quote, work out their own salvation, end quote. And these unfinished offerings, for some a statue, others a novella, are one way to escape the confinement of their existence and assert a type of agency that may not be possible in the present. Davis, be it in her aversion to being photographed or the expert way she unfinishes the narrative, remains concerned with a life's work, and especially the prolonging thereof. Hugh's work is accomplished through a statue that reaches out into the night and asks, quote, terrible questions in its time and in the narrator's, and certainly today in ours. The narrator's work begins by revealing this statue and ultimately consists of laying bare an injustice, while at the same time offering a hope to be tested, which we are to understand, of course, will necessarily be at a time in the future and with information located there. Were I to summarize my work today and my larger project in one sentence, it would be this. The unfinished is an act of hope, requiring faith that a nameless reader in an indefinite future might answer the question that we ourselves cannot, or at the very least, a hope that they'll continue to ask it because it matters. As I wrap up my time here today, let's take a look at where the narrative leaves Deborah. In much the same way, there is an escape to the Quaker hillside for Deborah. Are we to understand this as the hope we were promised, or God, quote, taking care of his own, end quote? On a fictional hillside, the narrator announces that, quote, I end my story here, end quote. This is significant because, of course, the story does not actually end there in practice or in theory. No, Davis does not leave us in a serene, sunlit pastoral scene of forgiveness. Rather, she leaves us with the image of a, quote, dumb, woeful face that belongs to and ends with the night, end quote. Instead of fitting endings, Davis offers what can best be termed as inconvenient art. The author of Life in the Iron Mills did not neatly end a story in a diegetic or even altogether tragic fashion. Rather, she wrote a story that haunts, one that lives, a story that is unresolved and unfinished, a story we still care to talk about today. A lasting image, artfully crafted, demands consideration after the text's final line. American writers, perhaps none more emphatically than Davis, her narrator and statue, are all insisting on safeguarding the futurity of their stories, leaving their readers unsettled and daring us to let the story end there. And for me, this is true throughout the American literary canon. Perhaps the most famous example in 19th century American literature is that of the Scarlet Letter, a piece of fabric dusty with time and discovered by a narrator equipped to tell a long ago, then unfinished story, notably with an incongruous preface. A, quote, surviving spell, as Hawthorne dubs it. Here again is an object that asks and provides an answer to Davis's, quote, terrible question. Less tangible, but no less acute, Melville's Ishmael, quote, survives the shipwreck as if to reply to this very same query. Is this the end? They ask with Davis. No. A statue, like a shipmate, survives to, in effect, quote, tell the story. And from Davis to Melville, these stories, as told retrospectively by these narrators, are a resounding chorus of no. No, say America's 19th century authors, this is not the end. The American unfinished is achieved in several ways, but it is always toward the same end, which is to say, no ending at all. Thank you.
All right. I need to change my title. I changed it, and so it's now my title is quoting Davis, Nothing Beneath All, and then Rebecca Harding Davis's critique of possessive individualism in Life in the Iron Mills. And so this is a 40-page paper, and so you're going to hear part of section 2. So this is really the aesthetic part. First part deals with C.B. McPherson's concept of possessive individualism, and I think about how kind of Lockean natural rights are sort of played with in the text. The last one is dealing with freedom and beauty in Kant and Lacan. So the title of this section is Looking Deeper, Davis's Rhetoric of Penetrative Vision and the Subject of Rights. During the novella's opening scene, crowds of Irish and Welsh puddlers are portrayed as having, quote, dull, besotted faces, an external effect of the contaminating environment of the ubiquitous smoke, which, quote, rolls sullenly in slow folds from the great chimneys of the iron foundries and settles down in black slimy pools on the muddy streets. The workers make their way to the mills, making their ways to the mills are described by the narrator as a slow stream of human life, and thereby symbolically linking them to the nearby, quote, Negro-like river slavishly bearing its burden. The implicit equation of industrial workers with African-American slaves is ostensibly intended to suggest that Hugh Wolfe and those of his class maintain the status of what William Paul Simmons has referred to as cauterized others, those who are considered to exist beneath humanity and therefore branded as rightless. These men whose flesh is begrimed with smoke and ashes, who have been breathing from infancy to death, an air saturated with fog and grease and soot, appear to be fully overdetermined by their social environment. If the material conditions of the worker's existence are to be viewed symbolically as vileness for soul and body, the narrator asks, is there nothing beneath, no surplus dimension of the subject that might escape such environmental corruption? If such a subject exists, what are its features and how can it be represented? In order to answer these questions, we must first examine Davis's strategic use of what I refer to as the rhetoric of penetrative vision. When deployed as a structural device, and not merely as a trope. The narrator's incitement to penetrative vision formalizes a peculiar reading practice intended to graft the reader's desire onto the text via his or her quest to discover the answer to a secret. Davis's aesthetic strategy, as I will show, is characterized by the formal repetitions induced by deferral and failure. Rather than being confronted with the final truth about the worker's condition, the possibility of hope, The reader instead witnesses a series of missed encounters with the workers' souls via external appearances and the constitutive failure of representation to reach beyond itself. There is, in other words, no final revelation of a missing signified that would explain all from a godlike perspective, only the metonymic sliding of signifiers around a central void, namely a secret that cannot be revealed. The circling of signifiers does not merely testify to the fundamental openness of signification, but instead it formalizes an internal limit. While this limit serves as a ballast around which conflicting moral positions and rhetorical figures may be contested and deconstructed, it also, and more crucially, inscribes a prohibition. Such a prohibition is required in order to declare the existence of a subject of rights, about whom we can never say all within the symbolic order. Throughout life, Davis's narrator suggests that penetrative vision is both key to accessing truth and the metonymy for an individual's freedom and spiritual fitness. The narrator declares, quote, "If your eyes are as free as mine to look deeper, no perfume-tinted dawn will be so fair with the promise of day that shall surely come." Moreover, because the novella is organized both formally and conceptually around the narrator's repeated imperative that the reader, quote, "look deeper into the heart of things," the text appears to oscillate between not only two aesthetic modes, literary realism and romanticism, but also two distinct and potentially contradictory epistemological positions that serve as the foundation for moral judgment. On the one hand, life grounds notions of justice and the validity of empirical experience. To be just is to recognize that the crime committed by Wolfe is the effect of a corrupt environment that has stunted and disoriented his higher nature. Even though Wolfe possesses a, quote, "fierce thirst for beauty" and a talented as an artist, the slow years of heavy years of constant hot work have made him little more than a, quote, "dumb, hopeless animal." The material circumstances of his life have left his, quote, "brain greedy, dwarfed, full of thwarted energy and unused powers," and led him to a sort of moral arrested development. The ostensibly upper class readers fail to understand their moral responsibility because they're unable to see clearly how conditions actually are for people like Wolfe. Looking deeper in this instance implies gaining access to knowledge through an act of demystification and examining the underlying organizing principles of social reality. On the other hand, however, the narrator suggests that justice depends more crucially upon the reader's ability to look beyond appearances towards the possibility of an inner spiritual reality. Rather than merely emphasizing the difference between deceptive surface appearances and some hidden, though fully accessible, objective truth, life obsessively maintains the distance between empirical reality and a secret that cannot be disclosed. As Andrew J. Schreiber has observed, the secret functions in life as an unknown infrastructure, quote, "an element not directly accessible or evident in the surface of the discourse, but one that underwrites the text's deconstructive energies." Davis's narrator asserts, "I dare not put the secret into words. I told you it was dumb. These men going by with their drunken faces and brains full of unawakened power do not ask it of society or of God. Their lives ask it, their deaths ask it. There is no reply. I will tell you plainly that I have a great hope, and I bring it to you to be tested. It is this, that this terrible dumb question is its own reply, that it is not the sentence of death we think it, but from the very extremity of its darkness, the most solemn prophecy which the world has known of hope to come." While the narrator's reference to hope to come promises some spiritual or temporal beyond to the degradation of the present, the aesthetic embodiment of such hope and the cliched image of the dawn depicted throughout the text perpetually collapses under contradictions. As critics have pointed out, the rhetoric of religious reform and spiritual redemption prominently featured in the novella seem less aimed at assisting the reader in imagining some form of absolute truth or divine deliverance than in exposing such rhetoric as a potent means of manipulation. As Sharon M. Harris has observed, much of life's religious symbolism is intentionally ironic, indicating that the word can easily be corrupted by the capitalist and reformer alike. Harris maintains that Davis transformation or transitions from romanticism to realism precisely by strategically ironizing the romantic imagery of 19th century Christian reformers, especially that of the dawn, in order to critique their empty promises. So when Davis's moralizing narrator concludes the novella by proclaiming, against the emotive backdrop of a flickering nebulous crimson sunrise, that God has set the promise of the dawn. We are to view it suspiciously as a hypocritical rhetoric of the reformer. Throughout life, the truth that would be revealed to the reader's penetrating gaze is continually deferred, displaced, and negated by an artifice that seems constituted on the very basis of its inability to reveal anything more than external manifestations. This should not be viewed, however, as merely an indication that life is paralyzed by its peculiar version of romantic irony, or as Michael D. West has succinctly put it, the artist's, quote, drive to create aesthetic order as a means of embodying a vision, but also to shatter that order as an inadequate betrayal of that vision. Rather, life unfolds dense and often contradictory layers of imagery and narration in order to not only highlight the status of textual surface as a mediating artifice, one filled with contradictions, but also to maintain the dimension of the secret as a surplus element of the real in the Lacanian sense, as that which must be prohibited in order for the subject to retain its freedom. As Joan Kopchak observes, quote, in order for the symbolic to evict the real and thereby establish itself, a judgment of existence is required. That is, it is necessary to say that the real is absented, to declare its impossibility. The symbolic, in other words, must include the negation of what it is not. This requirement is not without its paradoxical effects, for it means ultimately that the symbolic will not be filled with only itself, since it will also contain the surplus element of negation. According to this reasoning, which is to be found in Freud's 1919 essay, Negation, that which is impossible must also be prohibited. By instituting a structure of repetition and failure, that's end quote, by the way. By instituting a structure of repetition and failure, life holds open the possibility of an unknowable subject, an unrepresentable subject without predicate whose rights ontologically precede their symbolic articulation. Consequently, the surplus element of negation represented by Secrecy in the novella radically disrupts the tendency to view the lives of those like Woolf and Deborah as overdetermined by the causality of historical social forces, as might be the view of social Darwinism on the one hand, or limited by the failure to achieve unachievable moral or social ideals, as might be the view of Christian reformers on the other. Instead, Davis initiates the reader's desire to see the outlines of a subject whose preservation depends, ironically, upon both the judgment of its existence and the assurance of its invisibility. In this way, the desire and failure to see it itself becomes representative of a peculiar way of knowing. The narrator adopts this strategy, for example, when considering the lives of the workers in the iron mills. After describing the hellish conditions of the mills and recounting the history of Deborah's unrequited passion for Hugh, the narrator reflects, quote, if you could go into this mill where Deborah lay and drag out from the hearts of these men the terrible tragedy of their lives, taking it as a symptom of the disease of their class, no ghost horror would terrify you more. A reality of soul starvation, of living death that meets you every day under the besotted faces on the street. I can paint nothing of this, only give you the outside outlines of night. A crisis in the life of one man, whatever muddy depth of soul history lies beneath, you can read according to the eyes that God has given you, end quote. In this remarkable passage, physical, aesthetic, and spiritual limitations are fused together via supplementary logic that continually remodels and remaps textual surfaces. The act of seeing, mediated through the series of displacements, become virtually indistinguishable from the act of reading. Because the reader cannot go into the mill where Deborah lay, he or she does not directly encounter the reality of soul starvation and living death under the besotted faces on the street. In lieu of the reader's direct access to the physical conditions of such suffering, the narrator must offer an aesthetic representation, knowing that even a realistic form of artifice, such as this one, will inevitably fail to convey the truth of the worker's spiritual condition. However, if we were to drag out from the hearts of these men and women their stories of tragedy, we would still only glimpse the symptoms of the disease of their class. Likewise, the narrator must admit that he or she can paint nothing of the reality of soul starvation, but only offer the outside outlines of one man's story. We cannot know this form of living death or disease directly, but can only ever know its external manifestations, and only then in a fragmentary way. In short, when we peer beneath the surfaces of the besotted faces, we find only more layers of contamination, the muddy depth of the workers' own fragmented narratives, their soul histories. Throughout life, Davis's narrator insists that the truth must be discovered by such repeated acts of textual excavation. Underneath each veiled surface of a face, a story, a symptom, a physical location, however, lies yet another surface to be penetrated. The traumatic revelation of the worker's true soul must always be, to some degree, deferred by endlessly externalizing process of narrativation. Importantly, the repetitions induced by the process of penetrative vision throughout Bella preserve the subject precisely by prohibiting our direct access to it. The narrator's imperative for us to bear witness to the other is bound to the notion that reading is not only an active form of seeing, but also evidence of the formal enactment of grace itself. The narrator's pronouncement that we can only read according to the eyes that God has given us echoes Jesus' message to his disciples in Matthew 13. When asked why he speaks to the masses in parables, he responds, because they seeing see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand. Madeline Boucher has observed that parables may be viewed as language events, and that they have the power to move the hearer to decision and action. The capacity of life as a parabolic language event resides not merely in its poetics, the ability of its evocative imagery to depict the reality of class relations or convey multiple layers of symbolic meaning, but more significantly, in the peculiar way of its guiding imperative to look deeper, held the reader at the level of his or her desire. If Jesus's disciples are blessed because they can see and hear spiritual truth, the parable instructs others through a brief symbolic or narrative or allegory in ways that seek to formalize grace. As Gunther Bronfman notes, the ambiguity of Jesus's parables was not meant to alienate his listeners, but instead embody a mystery, namely the mystery of the hidden dawn of the kingdom of God itself amidst a world which to human eyes gives no sign of it. As I have already mentioned, Davis generally treats such representations of divine revelation, such as imagery of the dawn, with suspicion and irony. For our purposes, I would argue that life introduces to the reader a parabolic or curved relation to the text and reality, one that opens a space for the circulation of the subject's desire and consequently the opening of a form of transcendence via the real. And if according to Kopchak, the real is by definition that which has no adequate signifier, its existence can only be declared by repetition through the signifier's repeated attempt and failure to designate itself. It is, in other words, because of the signifier's radical inability to signify itself that the real is circumscribed within the symbolic as impossible. To be clear, the structure of supplementation generated by Davis's insistence on penetrative vision does not simply induce the reader to a retroactive false belief in the presence of some inaccessible truth, when in reality there is only the endless drift of difference. On the contrary, as the reader descends through layers of imagery, the metonymic flow of signifiers circumscribes the real as a surplus, that which, to use Jacques Lacan's convenient phrase, quote, doesn't stop not being written. According to Jesus and the verses from Matthew cited above, in order for the people to be healed, the dimension of the miraculous, i.e. the impossible, must be declared and maintained via a transformed dynamic relation to the law. For Davis, the promise of a hope to come is signified by the acknowledgement of a hidden subject, a subject whose very existence is, we might say, miraculous, due to the fact that it cannot be reduced to and consequently disrupts the causal chain of symbolic reality. From this perspective of morality and politics, such a subject mirrors the ontological significance of the conception of the rights of man for citizens. For as Etienne Balibar has observed, because such a conception of rights clearly exceeds the property rights of one people, it establishes a notion of rights, quote, without any pre-established limitation. Consequently, the subject's relation to the law is radically inverted. And I'm ending here, so prepare yourself. Rather than being determined by the subjection to the law, it is a subject of self-legislation that is predicated by its free will. Thank you.
Okay, in this paper, I'm focusing on Davis's Life in the Iron Mills and Melville's The Paradise of Bachelors and the Tartarus of Maids. To begin with, and to give the argument here at the beginning, in placing these two narratives together, I'm seeing that they complement one another in their depictions of industrial pollution. and industry's disturbing effects on the body, or I should say haunting effects on the body, for in both texts, mill workers are turning into ghosts. Ghosts and dangerous air in these stories go hand in hand. In other words, the polluted industrial air is spectral and it is turning mill workers into specters. I thought I would discuss how my research on ghosts and industrial pollution came to be, just briefly. Next, I'll move to the theoretical and historical framing of my argument, and then I will transition to some close readings from these two narratives, ultimately showing why I'm bringing these two stories together to discuss specters and pollution. My work on Davis and Melville is one section of one chapter of my dissertation on industrial specters of 19th century literature. I move from the mill to the port to mines in this project. So this work on Davis and Melville is, of course, in the mill section with Davis's iron mills and Melville's paper mill depictions. My project began now nearly a couple years ago in a seminar on environmental risk, where I was first introduced to Ulrich Beck's Risk Society in discussing threats that are invisible, such as radiation. Beck makes this really interesting move that I'm going to call a Gothic move to say that there is a shadow kingdom, quote, of invisible threats brought on by industrialism. The shadow kingdom is a second reality, Beck says, that threats human life on this earth. My introduction to Beck and the shadow kingdom argument happened to be at the same time I was studying Davis's life in the iron mills. And while our seminar conversation focused on Davis's realism in depicting the ironworks town and industrial pollution, I was stuck on the story's use of ghost and ghostly, which I will look at in detail with you here in a second. Now, we never see the word ghost in Melville's story, I must confess, but we do have paper mill workers, all women, who become sheet white, just like the paper they create. And as our narrator approaches the mill, he experiences a gust of wind laden with lost spirits coming from the direction of the paper mill. I will turn to Melville's narrative here soon. I was finding that characters in both narratives are disturbingly becoming one, merging with their industries, becoming their surrounding industrial pollution. My theoretical framework is drawing upon environmental humanities work, studies in the Gothic, and critics who are, of course, bringing together environmental humanities with studies of the Gothic, like I am doing. To begin, Sean Shu asks, how does air transform bodies? What makes atmospheres become imperceptible or perceptible? I envision my work on industrial specters as beginning to answer this question. How does air transform bodies? How can we even see this in the first place? Stacy Alaimo's work is an important starting point for my theoretical framework. So you heard me say these characters are becoming one with their industrial environments. So Alaimo's framework of transcorporeality is crucial. Transcorporeality being the recognition that, quote, the human is always intermeshed with the more than human world. At the risk of putting this too simply, as humans, we are porous and in constant exchange with our surroundings. Alaimo's transcorporeality framework disrupts the idea that the human is a bounded entity, and also, importantly, for my research, this recognition also suggests bodily risk, especially in a setting like the iron mill or the paper mill. Speaking of the porous body, the threatened body, I'll now turn to some of the Gothic theory that's crucial for my work. The first is Eugenia de la Motte, who claimed that at the heart of the Gothic, she's speaking transatlantically here and of the 19th century, the heart of the Gothic, she says, is an anxiety over the boundaries of the body. Those bodily boundaries are undone with a recognition of transcorporeality. And so including this theory is vital when thinking about the fears of, for instance, inhaling industrial pollution. Secondly, Jesse Oak Taylor's work on the Gothic and pollution has been central for me, especially his chapter on the polluted body in his work, The Sky of Our Manufacture. In addition to theorists like Alaimo, de la Motte, and Taylor, I'm also drawing upon 19th century ghostology and public health studies To summarize, the critic Matthew Taylor argues in the mid to late 19th century in the US context, ghosts and materialist science were mutually possessed, each haunted by the other. I'll turn now to some key primary passages of toxic ghosts, first from Davis and then from Melville. So now Davis. At more than one point in Davis's narrative, she describes the thick, dangerous air surrounding the mill, and at one point explains that workers breathe this in. Breathing from infancy to death, the narrator says, an air saturated with fog and grease and soot, vileness for soul and body. The haunting industrial conditions in life in the iron mills becomes most vivid when the narrator describes the mill at night. Crowds of half-clad men looking like revengeful ghosts in the red light, hurried, throwing masses of glittering fire. The haunting atmosphere of the iron mill appropriately contains dreadful phantoms. It's important here to move the conversation between Mitchell and Kirby, since they remark on this spectral scene and the way that the mill workers are becoming their mill environment in a haunting way. Mitchell describes the smoldering scene of the iron mill at night as ghostly, unreal. Kirby, and this is young Kirby, responds to Mitchell by saying, "These spectral figures, as you call them, are a little too real for me to fancy a close proximity in the darkness." Now, Mitchell pointed to the environment. The smoldering scene is ghostly. Kirby, however, pointed to the workers, spectral figures. The spectral figures are becoming conflated with this environment. They're turning into their ghostly environment. When the narrator describes the terrible tragedy of the workers' lives, they explain that the men experience a living death, as we've heard today. The narrator describes our protagonist, Hugh Wolfe, as a member of the living dead. During Hugh's transformation to a specter, he endures bleeding at the lungs and a death cough. I want to pause here at death cough. What more could show a violent exchange between the body and one's environment than a death cough? We see transcorporeality in action here with the body's rejection of air that has already damaged the lungs. And speaking of Hugh's transformation to a ghost, the moment of full transformation, say, is crucial. When the narrator prefaces Hugh's death, they say that it was as if he should never hear human voices again. The modifier human seems odd in this sentence, as if Hugh will still hear voices, but not human ones. When Hugh kills himself, the narrator describes Hugh's vision turning to a vapor. All the people Hugh sees when he dies, all of whom had been described as ghostly before, quote, floated together like a mist and faded away, leaving only the clear, pearly moonlight. The story's famous coral statue, made by Hugh, adds to the focus on permeable bodies in this industrial space. And here is the description. In the neighboring furnace buildings lay great heaps of the refuse from the ore after the pig metal is run. Coral, we call it here, a light, porous substance of a delicate waxen flesh-colored tinge. Porous and flesh-colored, like the workers. In my article, I go into depth here on this statue being waste, the workers being treated as waste, transformed by the smoke of steam power, also waste. I argue that Hugh's transformation into a ghost, looking at the narrator through the statue, as we've heard of it already, is what haunts the narrator, prompting the narrator to write this in the first place. As Davis's narrator claims, no ghost horror would terrify you more. Now to Melville. Both visible and invisible dangers exist in Melville's paper mill, and it is these invisible dangers that Melville's use of spectrality helps us to see. The narrator begins with the visible dangers, the blades, that turn their cut-up shirts into pulp for paper. While the blades are the most obvious danger posed in the mill, the narrator immediately turns to the effects of the mill's dangerous particles hovering in the air. Both the narrator and the guide begin coughing in the rag room, then coughing in this paper mill, like Hugh Wolfe's own coughing shows transcorporeality in action. Our narrator turns to Cupid, our guide in this story, and asks this crucial question. What makes those girls so sheet white, my lad? The guide's answer clearly links their hazardous mill atmosphere to their paleness. Why? I suppose it's the handling of such white bits of sheets all the time makes them so sheety. The women have become the paper that they help manufacture. They have also become the hazards that are involved in the paper making process. Here's the clear description from Melville that shows his attention to hazardous air. The air swam, he writes, with the fine poisonous particles, which from all sides darted as motes and sunbeams into the lungs. To best portray particles going into the lungs, Melville describes the women as sheet white, as spirits. The women's spectrality makes clear what had been impossible to fully see. The mechanism of these particles moving into the lungs, damaging the women's bodies, transforming them to a state of death in life. Now, bringing these narratives together, I argue that the Ghosts and Davis's and Melville's narratives have, paradoxically, become, quote, real for us. Pairing Davis's and Melville's industrial narratives brings these toxic ghosts to light. The stories complement one another. Life in the Iron Mills discusses ghosts explicitly, whereas Tartarus of Maids only describes the women as sheet white. Melville clearly describes the dangerous air, which swam with fine poisonous particles, while Davis's language at times remains more coded, like a nightmare fog. With the two stories together, we get a fuller picture of industrial environments transforming workers' bodies. But I am left with more questions at this point in my research, as I have moved in my dissertation from mills to industrialized ports and now ports to mines. I'll share just a couple of these with you. So in the mill section of my research, I'm thinking through the mill space as also, of course, haunted by extractive labor of the enslaved. So thinking of cotton, also thinking of some metal mining, especially Latin America. It's important to pause too and note that Cupid in Melville's story is described as, quote, dark complexioned. I'm working through how best to articulate this further haunting of the mill space. I'm also thinking about the gendered spaces of mills, the iron mill where white men are working, the paper mill where white women are working, and how to not let ghost and specter make my argument less attentive to gender as well as race. So those are my questions to take up or not now, and thank you so much for your time today.
Hi, I also wrote about life in the iron mills in comparison to Paradise of Bachelors and Tartarus of Maids. I'm hoping that it's a little bit different enough because I did focus on kind of the writing style of both the sketch with the bachelors and with the maids. And this paper's been a really interesting experience for me to write. So I was in Dr. Robin Walder's literature class, and when we transitioned from romanticism to realism, she would give us characteristic sheets. And one of our assignments was to go through and show how life in the iron mills fit both realism and romanticism. And for me, I fell in love with Melville and romanticism, having read Paradise. I approached her and I said, well, I kind of noticed that Melville was doing a lot of realist traits and realist characteristics in Paradise, and I was very curious about that. And she said, well, you can write that paper. So this paper ended up becoming an independent study for me. And it took on a whole life of its own, where I didn't realize how much overlap, like you had said, Lauren, there were between the two stories. And it kind of started with me trying to write Melville as a realist writer because he does not necessarily have that reputation. And it ended up me seeing how he almost laid a foundational work for Davis to then craft life. So I'll start with the paper. I talked about Twain in the full paper, but this is kind of the shortened version, just focusing on Davis. So 6 years before Rebecca Harding Davis's Life in the Iron Mills, Herman Melville wrote a story called The Paradise of Bachelors and the Tartarus of Maids. In it, he depicts the horrid conditions of factories and describes a factory tour to showcase these conditions and their detriment to the human soul. It sounds very familiar to life, and despite the fact that Melville wrote this story before life, American scholar Wester Hesfeld claims that Life in the Iron Mills is the first notable work of fiction to concern itself with the life of the factory worker. And scholar Sharon M. Harris declares that Rebecca Harding Davis's Life in the Iron Mills represents a startlingly new experiment in literature and a pioneering document in American literature's transition from Romanticism to realism. To me, these quotes seem to be oversights, kind of forgetting Melville in the conversation. And they weren't committed out of malice, of course. They were just speaking to the idea that Melville has been overlooked in the conversation regarding early realists. These are oversights, nonetheless, that I, as a lover of Melville, wanted to correct. Now, in asserting that Melville was a realist writer predating Davis, and I stress this especially because I am presenting on the Rebecca Harding Davis panel, I do not intend to detract from what Davis did as an early realist writer. Her contributions to American literature deserve countless papers and endless scholarship. I merely wish to broaden how readers view Melville and put him into the realist writer conversation. I could not live with his legacy ending with Moby Dick. When seeking to articulate an argument that Melville's Paradise is a work of realism predating life, it seemed natural to first explore the characteristics of realism and then compare the two works. Finding the traits of realism was relatively easy. Using Richard Chase's The American Novel and Its Tradition, Washington State University deconstructs American realism into the following characteristics. 1, realism renders reality closely and in comprehensive detail, even at the expense of well-made plot. 2, character is more important than action and plot. 3, complex ethical choices are often the subject. 4, characters appear in their real and in the complexity of temperament and motive. 5, class is important, particularly serving the interests and aspirations of the middle class. 6, events will usually be plausible. 7, diction is natural vernacular, not heightened or poetic. 8, the tone may be comic, satiric, or matter of fact. And 9, objectivity in presentation becomes increasingly important. After this checklist, I thought it would be very clear that Melville used these characteristics of realism prior to Davis. I would just simply go through the list and check off each characteristic that Melville used in Paradise. And with any luck, at the end of the tally, he would have more check marks than Davis. Also, with chronology seemed to be on my side with him writing it beforehand, him writing it in 1855. I thought this would be simple, and the fact that Melville was a realist, I would just be able to add his name to the list in the conversation, at least in my circles. And what I ended up finding was much more complex. I ended up finding that there were many connections between Melville and Davis's work, and by comparing the two, I discovered that Melville's Paradise acts as a pseudo blueprint for Davis to craft life. Paradise then becomes a foundational structure on which American realism has been built, similar to how people talk about Davis's life. This paper is my exploration into the similarities between the two pieces and how the elements found within Melville's prose could have inspired Davis's writing of life. Essentially, what I found was that there could be no life in the iron mills. There must first be men dining in heaven and maids dying in hell. Beginning with composition, both Melville and Davis draw on real-life experiences to assist their efforts to portray the subject matter honestly and truthfully. Melville's two sketches did not come from the imagination, but were originally inspired by and based upon real-world experiences. Melville crafts these two sketches based on two actual experiences in his life. First, in December of 1849, Melville was feted by several acquaintances from the London literary and legal community at Elm Court Temple, this event inspiring bachelors. Second, after about a year after that event had happened, Melville took another trip to purchase paper from Carson's Mill in Dalton, Massachusetts. This event inspired maids. In these trips, Melville was affected by the two alternating realities in which people at the uppermost and lowermost extremes of society live. One, the heightened luxury at a dinner party of the Templar, and the other, the horrendous conditions of factories and the effects of industry on the human soul. This is similar to how Davis, according to Tilly Olson in her biographical interpretation of Davis, Davis absorbed the sights and sounds of the steel town in which she grew up and later used those memories to craft life. Because both works show deep connections to real-life experiences of the authors, they both serve as excellent examples of early literary journalism, a technique famously used by many American realists, such as Twain and Howe. Literary journalism seeks to report one's experiences and sights, translating those powerful images into fiction. That is essentially what realism is at its core. Each beginning paragraph of Melville sketches showcases this reporting author mindset and seem to be connected to the beginning paragraph of life. Extraordinarily similar to the famous opening lines of Life, where Davis's narrator in the first person invites the reader to come down with him or her into the thickest fog and mud to hear the story, exists Melville's opening to Paradise. In it 6 years earlier than Davis's, Melville's narrator takes the reader on a trip into heaven and hell. In Bachelor, Melville guides the reader up to paradise through the mud of Fleet Street. He begins in the grime and leads the reader out of it using second person to communicate intimacy. Quote, "You turn a mystic corner, not a street. You glide down a dim monastic way flanked by dark, sedate, and solemn piles." He provides readers specific directions, inviting them to follow in his footsteps through the vile slums of the city. Then, what's inside Paradise? Melville tells the story in first person, using I and relating the tale of his night with the bachelors in very specific detail. In Maids, Melville also provides a specific description, establishing his credibility of the location of the Devil's Dungeon, describing the odorous grasses and haggard rocks. He then, in Prose Predating Life, describes his descent into the hellish paper mill, using first person to establish the reality that the narrator lived this horrid descent and he wants to share it with the readers. The similarities in the opening of the two sketches to that of Davis's story obviously demonstrates that Davis is not the first American writer in the time period of Romanticism to use realistic descriptions and language to usher readers into a very truthful and honest world. Moreover, because this piece was published in Harper Lee magazine, Davis, being an active participant in America's literary scene, would have likely read Paradise. And this is not a difficult conjecture, as Harper's New Monthly magazine had reached, within 6 months of its initial circulation, a readership of 50,000, which only fortifies the argument that Paradise helped inspire Life. This claim of a potential reading of Paradise by Davis is also strengthened by the similarities in plot between Maids and Life. In Maids, Melville's narrator is of a higher class than of the factory workers, and then must descend, literally and figuratively, into the lower class of the mill. The narrator, hopelessly fascinated by the workers, quote, begs to be taken on a tour. The tour is then given by a man named Cupid, who works at the mill, but is separate from the factory workers. He knows of the terrible conditions of the mill and is able to avoid them. He discusses them with the narrator throughout the tour. He tells the narrator that the Devil's Dungeon is, quote, no place for flowers. And he also points out the soullessness of the workers due to their, quote, blankness, lacking all emotion and feeling. On this tour, the narrator becomes fascinated by an inanimate object, which he describes it as if it were alive, quote, an iron animal that leaves the narrator, quote, spellbound. He comes to call the creature a, quote, great machine, end quote. At the end, the narrator leaves the mill, but the visions of the workers and the machine stay with him. Mirroring this plot structure, in Life, Davis writes of Clark and Kirby giving a tour to the factory to a reporter, Mitchell, and the Dr. May, men of a mysterious and upper class. On that tour, the men discuss how the factory is similar to Dante's Inferno, a literary recreation of hell, the exact word that Melville used to describe the factory 6 years previous. During the tour, the group come across an inanimate object, the Coral Woman, that Mitchell anthropomorphizes when he noticed her hunger. The group acknowledges the great statue, again, the exact descriptor, quote, great, that Melville uses to refer to the machine, and the statue's beauty, and then the group leaves the mill haunted by what they saw there. Life has a different central plot, of course, than what is detailed here, but the symmetry in the two stories cannot be denied. The differences between the stories actually further reveals that Melville's work is an almost greater and more realistic work than Davis's. Melville's Maids aligns with many of the characteristics of realism listed above. For example, it is a bare-bones sketch with a focus on the reality of the situation at the expense of plot. The story has a clear beginning, middle, and end, yet it ends the exact same way that it begins. There is character development for the narrator when he laments at the inequity of class, but it is not revealed to the reader what he does with this realization. It simply ends with the paper mill completely unchanged and the narrator questioning a social issue. The sketch is a snapshot of the immediate and does not shy away from truth, but it does not invent it either. The story also does not focus on any individual. The factory workers are, with few exceptions, presented as a part of a group. Melville strips them of their individuality because that is how he witnessed them. If he had given them character, it would have detracted from the realism. The narrator had not taken time to meet any specific workers, so Melville instead presents them as a group of maids. Because of this, the sketch focuses primarily on subject and a complex ethical choice regarding class the narrator and to the reader must then make. Melville presents only information that the narrator is witnessing and never claims to understand any other character's thoughts or emotions. The prose as well is written in a very matter-of-fact tone, and the language, given the time it was written, has little trace of convolution and is delivered objectively. The reader leaves without explicit didacticism. In contrast, life, though meeting some of the characteristics of realism, appears to have more ties in the language back to romanticism than Maids. For example, there is no character development in life, and instead it focuses primarily on the life of an individual character, Hugh. The plot of Maids is controlled by the narrator, while Hugh is controlled by the plot of life, seemingly at fate to what the narrator tells of her, illustrating that in Davis's tale, plot takes precedent over character. Furthermore, life admits to being a story, admitting to its fiction, while Maids is always presented as literary fact. The sense of story versus fact is largely created due to the point of view of the two narrators. Maids is told completely in first person, giving the reader the feeling that the narrator actually experienced what is happening, while life, though bookended by a first-person narrator, uses a third-person style to tell the actual tale, making the work feel less real and more literary. The language used by this third-person narrator is also saturated by romantic language and themes. Throughout the piece, Davis uses lyrical prose to describe the emotions and feelings of the characters. When describing Hugh, the narrator describes his nature as was to be kind, even to the very rats that swarm the cellar. Being kind to rats in atrocious conditions while suffering each and every day is a perfect example of presenting the human ideal despite the immediate circumstances. She also opens by telling the tale that she has great hope for the future and wishes to see if readers can retain theirs after reading her story. Regardless of irony, the matter-of-fact tone that Melville presents is the mark of a true realist, because he's not even dealing in hope. He's merely just presenting his story and then allowing the reader to make his own choice about the factory. Again, to Davis's credit, and credit must be given to her, her story does fit many characteristics of realism, some that even Melville fails to reach. Her use of dialect is a perfect example of the realist movement's attempt to capture vernacular in the written word. All of Melville's characters speak the same way of a bastardized child of romanticism in real life, speaking eloquently of the deep, true human imperfections. Melville is interested in what the characters are saying, while Davis, interestingly, is focused on the sound of speech and how that can be copied by a writer. She writes the sounds using ye instead of you, dropping the final G and going. And these novel manipulations of American speech are ones that realists would become drawn to because they do provide an honest treatment of how real people speak and talk. The point of these comparisons that I've made in this paper between Paradise and life is not to claim that Davis fails to introduce and showcase elements of realism. Rather, it is to show that without Melville's Maids, Davis might not have written life as we know it today. For me, the fact that Melville, famous as he might be for Moby Dick, is never associated with American realism is a tragedy, and it needs to be openly discussed. Having established Melville's realism, when I further reflected on this paper, I realized that this paper could indeed be read as an analysis of how well read Davis was and how powerful a storyteller she was. Davis is associated with realism far more than Melville, and why that is deserves much more research. She clearly had a gift at reaching a very wide American audience, and I think that Americans might not have been ready for Melville in his bluntness and his bareness, but Davis, through irony and through satire, almost seems to trick them into accepting a realist work And for me, that was where I kind of wanted to go into much more research on this topic, but that's where I ended the paper. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you all. These were all wonderful papers, thank you. So I know that I have questions, I have many questions. And maybe we have about 10 or 12 minutes left for at least recorded discussion. So maybe I'm just going to throw out sort of a topic that I noticed, and then we can just kind of go from there, and wherever the conversation goes is fine. So one of the games I like to play at conferences is seeing how I can unite all the 4 different papers or 3 different papers. And one of the things that I kind of noticed, sort of the threads through your papers, was this idea of fixed boundaries and kind of playing with those boundaries. I think that each of you kind of talked about how Davis either breaks a boundary or the boundary that we think of as starting with Davis kind of gets broken. And so I guess I don't really have necessarily a cogent question for a specific person about that, but I guess just kind of what do you feel we maybe gain by breaking these boundaries in thinking about Davis or in thinking about her world, the mid-19th century that she lives in? Yeah, anybody want to take that?
Well, I can just say something. And the work that I'm doing, I mean, I think she's interesting in the way that a lot of people mention the fact that she's sort of right on the cusp between realism and romanticism. She has, obvious traits of both. That the kind of ethical and political imperatives of those are interesting to kind of think of. And the work that I'm doing, I guess I'm kind of thinking about maybe a third option, not the romantic. There's many possibilities. Stated or unstated, or that if we only knew the situation as it is, the term that you used, I think, overdetermined, and I was thinking the same way. But really what struck me about her piece is that she brings up this story talking about kind of injustice, but really about the problem of rights, how Woolf understands his rights, how we think about his rights, and how that sort of works in this aesthetics, that she's developing, and the way that we think about society, the way that we think about, justice, responsibility, any of those sorts of things. So, that's where I started thinking really was, so why is rights involved in this? How does this sort of split between these two ways of telling allow us to sort of think about another possibility for rights, not one that is fully saturated or knowable within society, or one that is sort of thinking about some possible beyond, but some other kind of ontological basis for it because of the sort of repetitions. This is such a strange text with all of its repeated phrases and everything.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. And I think that really resonates with Lauren's kind of point about just the body is porous, and kind of what those environmental rights looked like in the 19th century. Yeah, Lauren, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I would say boundaries are central for me in this paper, thinking the boundary of the body, the cough as trying to like expel this air, trying to a desire for a body that actually has a kind of boundary, boundedness within this industrial space, the boundary of the home, right, with Deborah and Hugh, thinking about now the narrators like in their home, the boundary between life and death, right, the death in life. So I like how Sean's talking about, like, actually let's think of this third, option, because we have here, this living death, right, that phrase is showing up here too. And I have to say, after hearing Sean's paper, every time I use the word real, as I was reading, I was a bit self-conscious of that use. So I have to say that, a new text coming into my work too is Derrida's Spectres of Marx too, thinking about, also, order boundaries, whatever you want to call it, of time being out of joint in this story as well. When, we know kind of where we are, not always in this text, right? Oh, we're in their house. Oh, okay, kind of realize, but also when are we, right? As we're reading. So just wanted to point that out too, with my use of the reel, that I'm also, gearing up for this, other option here as well.
Great, thank you. And that, Kacie, that kind of where Lauren ended kind of reminded me of where you started us, with that idea of when are we, like, and sort of that look to the future.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's exactly where I was thinking as well. This idea of the formal boundary of the text, which is where I'm most interested, which, I started at the ending of these, it's certainly not just Davis, but, looking at these last passages, and, there are several moments, but Davis is very explicit, like saying, I end my story here. And then, certainly, as you pointed out, Lauren, this temporal boundary that, the use of the narrator and, I would argue the use of the unfinished just sort of pushes us through that boundary, so that, here in 2021, the text is just as relevant, perhaps even more so. And so that's where sort of my research is landing. I'm still working through some questions, and certainly Davis is not the only author I'm considering, but I just think that it's very productive. I know several of us mentioned sort of this readership and how Davis had an attention to that in maybe a way that isn't discussed as often. So I was glad to see that, because that's certainly where my eye is toward what is Davis doing to sort of remove this boundary for a future reader.
Yeah, thank you, Kacie. And that is sort of reminding me of Jack. This is like really cool how it's going around. Sort of reminds me of Jack's, when you talk about readership, sort of like who was Davis also reading? Because we often write about her as a writer, but yeah, it's really interesting to think about kind of that she was also consuming these things and kind of working with those tropes that were kind of in existence. So yeah, really interesting. So I'm gonna kind of just open the floor. We have a few minutes, and if you have questions right now for each other, this is a great place to ask it. And then I do need to keep an eye on the time limit, and I'll just hit the stop recording button and we can continue talking afterwards. But any questions before we end the formal conversation? Okay, so I'm going to tell our audience that even though we aren't at the ALA in person, I'm sure that all 4 of our participants would be happy to converse more about their projects, and especially future pathways for research or things like that. And all of that information can be found in the program. So thank you for joining us today, and I will stop the recording now.